This director threatened the female inmates he oppressed, and this other director did this for so many years, he didn't even care about being caught on camera anymore. Total power corrupts totally, and we'll see several examples where prison directors abused their power on female inmates, beginning with J Garcia. Garcia's story begins like many prison administrators, working his way up through the ranks, eventually becoming an associate warden and then the warden of FCI Dublin. He was in charge of training staff on the Federal Prison Rape Elimination Act, the very law designed to prevent exactly the kind of crimes he would later commit. The irony is almost too bitter to comprehend. Between December 2019 and July 2021, Garcia embarked on what can only be described as a calculated campaign of sexual predation. He used his position of ultimate authority to sexually abuse 3 female inmates, women who were completely at his mercy within the confines of the federal prison system. The nature of Garcia's crimes reveals a disturbing pattern of exploitation. He would force inmates to pose naked or in provocative clothing, taking photographs with his government-issued phone, evidence that would later seal his fate. The assaults took place in various locations throughout the facility: the visitation room, bathroom, warehouse, cells, and electrical shop. Each location was carefully chosen, areas where Garcia knew he could exploit his victims without fear of immediate discovery. What makes Garcia's case particularly egregious is not just the nature of his crimes, but the systematic way he covered them up. When FBI agents interviewed him on July 22, 2021, Garcia looked them in the eye and lied, denying any sexual contact with inmates. This act of deception would later result in an additional charge of making false statements to government agents. The investigation into Garcia was part of a larger probe into systematic abuse at FCI Dublin. The facility had earned its notorious nickname among inmates and staff due to a culture of abuse and cover-ups that had persisted for years. Garcia wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was part of a broader pattern of misconduct that had infected the entire institution. On December 8, 2022, after a federal jury trial, Garcia was convicted on 8 charges: 3 counts of sexual abuse, 4 counts of abusive sexual contact, and 1 count of making false statements to government agents. Each sexual abuse count carried a maximum sentence of 15 years, while the abusive sexual contact charges could result in up to 2 years each. When sentencing day arrived on March 22, 2023, Garcia faced U.S. District Judge Yvonne Gonzalez-Rogers. The courtroom was filled with the weight of his victims' testimonies. One victim called him a predator and a pervert, while another noted that her sentence didn't include being sexually abused by staff. Garcia himself offered what seemed like genuine remorse, stating, "I'm sorry, beyond sorry, to the women I've hurt. I'm a broken man." Judge Rogers sentenced Garcia to 70 months, nearly 6 years in prison, along with 15 years of supervised release and $15,000 in restitution. But corruption and abuse of power within prison walls isn't limited to America. Across the Atlantic, a scandal in the UK would expose a different kind of betrayal, one that blurred the lines between guard and inmate in the most intimate and illegal way. Linda Dusa Abrao. Our second case takes us across the Atlantic to London, England, to HMP Wandsworth, a Victorian-era prison that has become synonymous with overcrowding, violence, and systemic failure. It was here that Linda Dusa Abrao, a 30-year-old prison officer, would become the center of a scandal that would shock the British public and expose the dire conditions within one of the UK's most troubled correctional facilities. The incident that would change Dusa Abrao's life forever occurred between June 26 and June 28, 2023. During this period, she engaged in sexual acts with inmate Linton Warwick, a 36-year-old man serving a 4-year and 9-month sentence for burglary. The encounter, lasting approximately 4.5 minutes, involved oral sex and vaginal intercourse, and was recorded by another inmate inside Warwick's cell. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the breach of professional conduct, but the context in which it occurred. HMP Wandsworth was and continues to be a facility in crisis. Built in 1851, the prison is severely overcrowded, with 80% of men sharing cells designed for one person. The conditions are described as inhumane, with damaged flooring, broken windows, leaking fixtures, and many cells lacking privacy screens around toilets. The recording of the sexual encounter quickly found its way onto social media on June 27, 2023, leading to widespread public outrage and a police investigation launched by the Metropolitan Police. Dusa Abrao was identified by prison staff and arrested on June 30, 2023, at Heathrow Airport while attempting to to board a flight to Madrid. Her attempt to flee the country only added to the scandal and suggested a level of premeditation that went beyond a momentary lapse in judgment. The legal proceedings that followed revealed additional layers to the story. On July 29, 2024, at Isleworth Crown Court, Dusa Abrao pleaded guilty to 1 count of misconduct in public office. The charge specifically stated that she willfully and without reasonable excuse or justification misconducted yourself in a way which amounted to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder by engaging in a sexual act with a prisoner in a prison cell. During the proceedings, claims emerged from a friend that Dusa Abrao was coerced or blackmailed, with inmates allegedly possessing her personal details, including her address, her husband's name, and knowledge of her OnlyFans account. However, these claims were not substantiated in court, and the judicial focus remained on her active participation.
Hello once again, Instagram. I hope you can appreciate this is going to be a very awkward and uncomfortable conversation for me to have. I just thought I really needed to come on here and clarify a lot of things. First thing being, there has been a lot, and I mean a lot, a tremendous amount of fake profiles of me that have been monetizing off of my misfortune, this scandal that the entire world has somehow managed to be involved in. I have not monetized one fucking bit at all. This is my only social media platform and I only just activated it again. So if you do come across fake profiles of me asking for money, please don't fall for it. There's been a lot of GoFundMes and fake OnlyFans accounts that are not me. And I do apologize if you have fallen for it. I honestly, but from the bottom of my heart, I apologize. But I really want to clarify that this is my only social media account and I just came back on.
On January 6, 2025, Dusa Abrao was sentenced to 15 months in prison. The court described her as an enthusiastic participant in the 4.5-minute encounter, emphasizing the breach of trust inherent in her role as a public servant. The judge's characterization of her behavior directly contradicted the narrative of coercion that had been suggested by her supporters. The impact of the scandal extended beyond Dusa Abrao herself. Weyrich, who had a pregnant girlfriend who was 7 months pregnant at the time of the incident, saw his partner hospitalized due to stress from the video's release, with fears of premature labor. The ripple effects of the scandal touched innocent lives, including an unborn child. While the London scandal made headlines back in the United States, a legal tidal wave was building, one that would reveal a systemic crisis of abuse stretching across decades and implicating hundreds of correctional officers. The New York prison system crisis. Our third case isn't about a single individual, but rather a systemic crisis that shook the very foundations of New York's correctional system. In what can only be described as an unprecedented wave of legal action, over 500 inmates filed lawsuits for sexual assault by correctional officers, exposing decades of abuse that had been hidden behind prison walls. The scale of these lawsuits is staggering and speaks to a crisis that goes far beyond individual bad actors. The legal actions were made possible by the Adult Survivors Act, ASA, which was effective from November 24, 2022 to November 24, 2023. This groundbreaking legislation created a one-year look-back window, allowing adult survivors of sexual assault to file civil lawsuits against their abusers or institutions, regardless of when the assault occurred. The numbers are truly breathtaking in their scope. During this window, over 3,000 civil suits were filed statewide, with nearly 20% alleging sexual violence against current or former prisoners. But even these numbers may not capture the full extent of the crisis, as reports vary significantly. CBS New York detailed 719 sexual assault lawsuits filed against the New York City Department of Correction, specifically related to Rikers Island, seeking $14 billion in damages. Meanwhile, another source mentions 750 victims filing lawsuits against New York State for failing to protect them while in prison, covering facilities like Bayview Correctional Facility and Bedford Hills. Perhaps most significantly, Slater Shulman LLP, a prominent law firm involved in the litigation, reported filing 1,218 cases against New York State, 479 against New York City, and others, totaling approximately 1,800 survivors of sexual assault while incarcerated. The variation in numbers suggests that the over 500 inmates mentioned in our research may represent just a subset of a much larger crisis. The allegations contained within these lawsuits paint a horrifying picture of systematic abuse. Many plaintiffs are women who were incarcerated, with reports detailing instances of rape, forced oral sex, and other forms of sexual violence. One survivor, Jenny, described being sexually abused multiple times during her 33 days at Rikers Island, stating, "They asked me to do most of the time oral sex or masturbation." What makes these allegations particularly credible and disturbing is the pattern that emerged during the investigation. Multiple inmates who did not serve time together and were not acquainted identified the same guards as perpetrators. This convergence of testimony from unconnected sources strongly suggests a pattern of abuse by specific officers and points to systemic failures in oversight and accountability. The facilities implicated in these lawsuits represent some of New York's most troubled correctional institutions. Rikers Island in particular has become a focal point, with nearly 700 lawsuits alleging abuse at this facility alone. But the crisis extends beyond Rikers to state facilities like Bayview Correctional Facility in Bedford Hills, indicating that the problem is not isolated to a single institution or jurisdiction. The historical scope of these allegations is equally disturbing. Some cases date back to the 1980s and 1990s, indicating that this crisis has been decades in the making. The fact that survivors had to wait for the Adult Survivors Act to seek justice speaks to the barriers that had previously existed for victims of prison sexual assault. Amid the flood of lawsuits and horrifying testimonies, one woman's voice rose from the shadows of FCI Alderson. Her name is Brian Moore, and her courage in confronting her abuser helped shine a spotlight on the rot within federal women's prisons. Brian Moore was incarcerated at FCI Alderson, a minimum security federal prison for women, for a drug-related offense. What should have been a place of rehabilitation and eventual redemption became a nightmare of exploitation and abuse at the hands of a prison captain, one of the highest-ranking officials at the facility. The nature of Moore's abuse reveals the calculated cruelty that can emerge when absolute power meets vulnerability. The captain exploited his authority by threatening to block Moore's transfer to a prison closer to her family, specifically her young daughter, if she did not comply with his sexual demands. This wasn't just physical assault, it was psychological warfare designed to break down Moore's resistance by threatening the one thing that mattered most to her, her relationship with her child. The assaults themselves took place in carefully chosen locations throughout the facility, deliberately selected to avoid surveillance cameras. This calculated approach indicates that the captain had not only planned these assaults, but had studied the prison security systems to identify blind spots where he could commit his crimes without detection. Moore's description of her ordeal reveals the profound power imbalance that exists within the federal prison system. "He was a captain with total control over me. I had no choice but to obey," she would later testify. The fear that kept her silent wasn't just about physical retaliation. It was about the very real possibility of being placed in solitary confinement or transferred to a facility thousands of miles from her daughter. Lasting impact of this abuse cannot be overstated. Moore noted in her testimony, "I'm still suffering. This has changed the course of my life forever." Years after her release, the trauma continued to affect every aspect of her life, demonstrating that the consequences of prison sexual assault extend far beyond the prison walls. Moore's courage in speaking out became part of something much larger than her individual case. On December 13, 2022, she testified before the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations at a hearing titled "Sexual Abuse of Female Inmates in Federal Prisons." This hearing was the culmination of an 8-month bipartisan investigation led by Senator John Ossoff that would expose the extent of sexual abuse within the federal prison system. The Senate investigation that Moore's testimony helped inform revealed staggering statistics about the scope of the crisis. BOP employees sexually abused female inmates in at least 19 of the 29 federal facilities that housed women from 2012 to 2022. The BOP opened 5,415 allegations of sexual abuse by staff during this period, with at least 134 cases confirmed. Perhaps most damning was the revelation of a massive backlog in investigations. There were approximately 8,000 internal affairs cases pending, including hundreds related to sexual abuse, some waiting for years without resolution. This backlog wasn't just administrative incompetence, it was a system that had fundamentally failed to protect the women in its custody. The investigation also revealed the institutional barriers that prevented accountability. Some abusive staff faced no consequences, and in certain cases, perpetrators were promoted despite allegations. This created a a culture of impunity where sexual predators could operate with little fear of meaningful consequences. Senator Ossoff described the situation as intolerable, emphasizing that sexual abuse constitutes cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment. The constitutional implications of Moore's case and thousands of others like it struck at the very heart of what it means to have a justice system that respects human dignity. Moore's testimony wasn't an isolated outcry. It echoed a long history of institutional failure at one of America's most infamous women's prisons, Edna Mahan Correctional Facility, where decades of abuse were enabled, ignored, and even protected. Edna Mahan. The scope of abuse at Edna Mahan is breathtaking in its duration and systematic nature. The facility has been the subject of numerous reports of sexual abuse by staff, affecting inmates over several decades. What makes this case particularly egregious is not just the number of victims, but the institutional response or lack thereof that allowed the abuse to continue for so long. The documented cases of abuse at Edna Mahan read like a catalog of institutional failure. In the 1990s alone, multiple correctional officers were found to have engaged in sexual relationships with inmates. Kevin Brody had a sexual relationship with an inmate parolee in 1994, leading to his firing and prosecution. William Jimenez stayed in a hotel with an inmate during a leave of absence in 1995. David Clapison admitted to sexual relations with an inmate in the summer of 1998 and entered a guilty plea for sexual assault. But perhaps most disturbing was the case of Stuart Sella, who between 1997 and 1999 sexually assaulted two inmates, Jacqueline Hagenmiller and Tammy Davis, on 10 separate occasions. He was fired and charged in 2000, but the fact that he was able to commit multiple assaults over a 2-year period speaks to a complete breakdown in institutional safeguards.
He's so full of garbage, so full of garbage. Tough, he wasn't tough. He played around with a lot of inmates in here, joking around and everything, and some people liked it, some people didn't. Like, you here to do your job, not sit here and abuse women. Like being a bully. I mean, even women that wasn't in this unit that would come from other units to come down for game room or something like that, he would bully them. He wasn't tough.
The abuse continued into the 2000s and 2010s with cases like James Galicchio, who in 2008 had a mutual sexual relationship with an inmate, smuggled a phone, and made 894 calls, including smuggling a pregnancy test. The term mutual is particularly problematic here, as it suggests consensual activity in a context where true consent is impossible due to the inherent power imbalance. In 2010, Eric Melgar faced sexual assault allegations from 6 inmates. While he was fired and reportedly paid the inmates $75,000 in 2017, he was never criminally charged, despite recommendations for prosecution. This case exemplifies the institutional failures that allowed predators to escape meaningful consequences for their actions. The pattern of abuse continued through the 2010s, with multiple officers facing charges for sexual assault and official misconduct. Joel Herskap, a kitchen worker, traded tobacco for sex with an inmate in October 2016, pleading guilty to multiple charges. Jason Mays was found guilty of sexual assault, criminal sexual contact, and official misconduct in September 2016. Thomas Seguin had sex with an inmate in February 2017, pleading guilty to official misconduct and receiving a 3-year sentence. The institutional response to these decades of abuse was wholly inadequate. A 2020 Department of Justice report, initiated in April 2018, found that sexual abuse had been rampant at Edna Mahan for decades, violating inmates' constitutional rights under the Eighth Amendment. The report highlighted a code of silence among staff, with officers either not reporting abuse due to distrust in the investigative system or actively concealing misconduct. The financial cost of this institutional failure was enormous. In April 2021, the New Jersey Department of Corrections reached a $20.8 million settlement with over 20 former and current female inmates who were sexually abused at Edna Mahan, covering abuses from 2014 to the settlement date. The settlement included damages and attorney fees, with additional measures like instituting body cameras for staff to enhance safety. The legal consequences extended beyond civil settlements. Multiple staff members faced criminal charges, with some pleading guilty and receiving sentences. In September 2022, 14 correctional officers were indicted for conspiracy and misconduct related to inmate assaults, with a 15th officer indicted in December 2023 on similar charges. In August 2021, the Department of Justice filed a complaint and proposed consent decree to resolve claims of constitutional violations. The decree mandated policies for prisoner supervision, confidential reporting, protections against retaliation, improved staff accountability, and transparency through public meetings. An independent monitor was appointed to ensure compliance, but not every survivor has a name that makes headlines. Some stories unfold in silence, buried by bureaucracy and fear. One such case is that of an unnamed woman whose abuse reveals how even basic survival can become currency behind bars. The Unnamed Guard. Our sixth case takes us into the shadows of the American prison system, to a story that illustrates one of the most insidious aspects of institutional abuse, the way it can become so normalized that it barely registers as newsworthy. This is the story of an unnamed female inmate who experienced what can only be described as systematic sexual predation by a correctional officer who used his position of power to turn basic human necessities into bargaining chips for sexual exploitation. The inmate's testimony reveals the calculated nature of the abuse she endured. The officer demanded sexual favors in exchange for essential items like food and hygiene, products including meals, soap, and toilet paper. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was a systematic campaign of coercion that exploited the complete dependence that prisoners have on their captors for the most basic human needs. The psychology behind this particular form of abuse is especially cruel. By controlling access to fundamental necessities like food and hygiene items, the officer transformed the inmate's most basic human needs into weapons of coercion. Every meal became a transaction. Every bar of soap came with a price that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with dignity and bodily autonomy. The abuse escalated when the officer raped the inmate in the laundry room, a location likely chosen for its lack of surveillance and isolation. The selection of this location demonstrates the premeditated nature of the assault and the officer's intimate knowledge of the facility's blind spots, areas where security cameras couldn't capture his crimes and where his victim's screams would go unheard. Following the assault, the officer threatened the inmate not to report the incident, intensifying her fear of retaliation. These threats weren't empty, they were backed by the very real power that correctional officers wield over every aspect of an inmate's daily existence. The officer could make her life unbearable in countless ways: restricted visitation, loss of privileges, placement in solitary confinement, or transfer to a more dangerous facility. The inmate's initial response to the abuse illustrates the impossible position that victims find themselves in within the prison environment. She initially kept silent due to fears of limited visitation rights and potential solitary confinement. These weren't paranoid fears. They were rational calculations based on the absolute power that correctional staff hold over inmates' lives. When she finally found the courage to speak out, the institutional response was devastating in its indifference. She reported the abuse to the prison superintendent, a counselor, and the state's investigative office, but received no response. This silence wasn't just bureaucratic inefficiency. It was an institutional betrayal that sent a clear message about how little her safety and dignity mattered to those charged with protecting her. She filed a grievance with the state correctional department, which was denied. The denial of her grievance represents more than just a procedural setback. It was a systematic rejection of her right to safety and justice. The message was clear. Her word meant nothing. Her suffering was irrelevant, and her attacker would face no consequences. Seeking justice through the courts proved equally futile. She joined a lawsuit against the guard and the prison, but this was dismissed without merits. This dismissal highlights one of the most pernicious aspects of the American justice system: the way legal barriers make it nearly impossible for prisoners to seek redress for abuse. The Prison Litigation Reform Act requires exhausting administrative remedies and proving physical injury for compensation requirements that create nearly insurmountable obstacles for sexual abuse victims. The impact on her mental health was severe and lasting. She tried accessing mental health services, but was turned away and offered Thorazine, which she refused due to observed side effects like self-harm. The prison's response to her trauma, offering powerful psychotropic medication rather than actual counseling, epitomizes the dehumanizing approach that many correctional systems take toward inmates' psychological well-being. And for those who already live on society's margins, like transgender inmates, the danger is even greater. In Jackson, Michigan, one such woman, known only as Jane Doe, was failed not once but twice by a system that should have protected her. Jane Doe. Our final case takes us to Jackson, Michigan, to the G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility, where a transgender female inmate known only as Jane Doe would experience a horrific assault that highlights the particular vulnerabilities faced by LGBTQ plus individuals within the American prison system. This case is especially significant because it demonstrates how even when policies exist to protect vulnerable inmates, institutional failures can render those protections meaningless. Jane Doe was a male-to-female transgender woman diagnosed with gender dysphoria Victoria, who found herself incarcerated at the G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility. On December 5, 2019, the Michigan Department of Corrections, MDOC, issued a medical order prohibiting her from being housed with non-gender dysphoric inmates to ensure her safety. This medical order wasn't just a bureaucratic formality. It was a recognition of the extreme vulnerability that transgender inmates face in correctional settings and a specific directive designed to protect Jane Doe from exactly the kind of violence she would ultimately experience. The policies in place should have protected Jane Doe. In 2017, following advocacy by transgender inmates and organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the ACLU of Michigan, the MDOC had revised its policy to allow transition-related care and established a Gender Dysphoria Collaborative Review Committee to evaluate housing requests on a case-by-case basis. Additionally, the Federal Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA, of 2003 mandates that housing decisions for transgender inmates be made on a case-by-case basis, explicitly stating that housing based solely on external genital anatomy violates its standards. Despite these policies and the specific medical order protecting Jane Doe, in January 2020, prison staff made a decision that would have devastating consequences. They forced her to share a cell with a male inmate serving a life sentence for raping and killing a woman. The cruel irony of this housing decision cannot be overstated. They placed a vulnerable transgender woman in a cell with someone whose previous crime was sexual violence against women. Jane Doe's response to this housing assignment reveals both her awareness of the danger she faced and her complete powerlessness to protect herself. She repeatedly protested the housing arrangement, presenting her medical documentation to prison staff, but was threatened with disciplinary segregation if she did not comply. The staff's response, threatening punishment for trying to protect herself, demonstrates a callous disregard for both the medical order and Jane Doe's safety. The inevitable occurred with tragic predictability. Within 24 hours of being forced into this housing arrangement, Jane Doe was raped by her cellmate. The speed with which this assault occurred after the housing assignment suggests that the danger was not only foreseeable, but virtually certain. What makes this case even more horrifying is that the institutional failures didn't end with the first assault. 5 days after the rape, Jane Doe was assigned to another cell with a different convicted rapist who pressured her to expose her genitals. This second housing decision demonstrates that the first assault taught prison staff nothing about the need to protect Jane Doe, or worse, that they simply didn't care about her safety. The pattern of housing Jane Doe with convicted rapists wasn't coincidental. It represents a systematic failure to implement existing policies designed to protect transgender inmates. Statistics from the National Center for Transgender Equality indicate that transgender inmates are 10 times more likely to be sexually assaulted by fellow inmates and 5 times more likely to be assaulted by staff. These statistics weren't unknown to prison administrators. They were the very reason policies like PREA and the MDOC's own guidelines existed. Following these assaults, Jane Doe filed a lawsuit against the MDOC on March 2, 2021, in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan, alleging failure to protect her. The lawsuit not only sought compensation for the harm she suffered, but also aimed to force systemic changes to prevent similar failures in the future. That brings us to the end of this video. For more interesting videos like this, click on the cards on your screen.